This presentation is specifically on Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. That's really one of the most misunderstood aspects of the Civil War. It was not really what a lot of people think it was, but it was very, very important nonetheless. Now, let's begin by looking at the steps that preceded the emancipation or freeing of the slaves. In July of 1862, Lincoln told his cabinet that he had decided on emancipating the slaves in the areas that were still under Southern control. But this was not made public. The next month, a very prominent newspaper editor by the name of Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, wrote an editorial, an open letter to Lincoln, criticizing him on moving too slowly toward freeing the slaves. Greeley was an abolitionist. Lincoln responded with a very famous letter. And he said, in answer to Greeley, and this was published in the paper, that his goal was simply to save the Union. And if he could save it by freeing some of the slaves or all of the slaves or none of the slaves, he would do it. But the goal was simply to save the Union. Now, this has often been cited by observers as proving that Lincoln really didn't care about slavery. That was not the case. It is true that his primary goal was to save the Union, but it's more complicated than that. And I want to look at what was really going on here. So why the difference? He had already decided to issue this proclamation, but he made no reference to it, and it made it sound almost like it was secondary, like it didn't matter so much. So what's going on? Well, first of all, he had a major political problem. The war was going badly for the North in 1862, and Lincoln was very worried about dissatisfaction in the border states. States like Kentucky and Missouri, and even free states of the North like Indiana, Southern Illinois, Southern Ohio. There was a lot of dissatisfaction with the North in those areas and in other northern areas as well. And Lincoln was very much afraid that the Democrats could win a victory in the congressional elections of November of 1862. Now, if that had happened, it could have been a disaster for the war effort. So Lincoln decided to wait for a Northern victory before moving publicly on emancipation. He got that victory at the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862. Okay, now we should say a little bit about the difference between the parties at this point. The Republicans were strong supporters of the war, but not all of them were equally supportive of ending slavery. The Democrats were very hostile to the idea of ending slavery. Some Democrats were peace Democrats, and they wanted to simply negotiate a deal with the South, and had they done that, the South would have been free to go its own way, and slavery would have been protected. The war Democrats were strongly in favor of the war, but they were not about to change the goals of the war. They wanted to save the Union. They did not want to end slavery. Now, if the Democrats had won those elections in the fall of '62, that might have meant a negotiated end to the war. And let's remember that if there's a tie, the South wins, because all they wanted was to go their own way, to be a separate country. So Lincoln was very concerned about that. Now, he decided that the best way to present emancipation was that it was a military necessity, because slaves were aiding the South in the war effort. They were sometimes digging trenches or providing manual labor for the Confederate Army. And of course, they were providing food and supplies that the Army needed to stay in the field. So slaves were a tool for the Confederacy, against their will certainly, but they were nevertheless being used by the Confederate Army. So what Lincoln did uh, a few days after the Battle of Antietam was to issue a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It was directed at the South, and he said, if you stop the rebellion, you can keep your slaves. Now, he knew very well they weren't going to do that, but he wanted to offer that publicly uh, to make it clear that his primary goal was simply to save the Union. And this fits in with the letter that he wrote to Horace Greeley. But he said this too, that if you continue the rebellion, I will legally free your slaves on January 1st, 1863. So he could sell this to the North as a military necessity, that freeing the slaves is necessary to win the war. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation is a very simple, nuts and bolts kind of document. Lincoln was a magnificent writer. He was very eloquent, but you don't find much eloquence in this document, and that's deliberate. He simply wants to make it look like a plain military order, so that it's presented as a military necessity. This is it. This is the document itself. Um, Now, on New Year's Day, 1863, Lincoln issued the proclamation. He made good on his threat to the South, and he freed the slaves in all areas that were controlled by the Confederacy. Now, this freed over 75% of the slaves, but they were not freed in areas under Union control. Now, this allowed him again to claim that he was only freeing those slaves that were aiding the rebellion, and therefore the whole idea of this was it was a military necessity. Now, this also prevented constitutional problems. Let's remember that the Dred Scott decision of 1857 was still the law of the land. And the author of it, Roger Taney, was still the Chief Justice of the United States. And he had said that slavery was legal everywhere, that slavery was a property right. And therefore, Lincoln did not really have the legal authority to end slavery by himself. That would take a constitutional amendment, and that was something that Lincoln worked for late in the war. And it finally became the 13th Amendment in 1865, and that is what officially and finally freed the slaves, all of them. Now, if we look at a map of the Emancipation Proclamation, its immediate effect, in these light brown areas here, those were areas under Confederate control. And these are the areas where he freed the slaves. Now, these dark brown areas here, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, were slave states, but they had remained in the Union, loyal to the Union. So it wouldn't have made sense, given Lincoln's stated reasoning, to free the slaves in those states. So he does not. Now, west for these yellow areas here, the northwestern counties of Virginia had seceded from the rest of Virginia. There were not many slaves there, and they remained loyal to the Union. And then that, of course, a few months later became the state of West Virginia, and slavery was still legal there. It was also still legal in areas here and then down here around New Orleans, where the North had military control. So only those slaves that were in those brown areas were freed by the proclamation. Now, what impact did it have? Well, some people were very cynical, and they said, well, Lincoln freed exactly those slaves that he had no ability to free, because, he didn't control those areas. But actually, it had a great deal more importance than that. First of all, it gave African Americans a greater motivation to fight in the war, and there were African American soldiers, because every time they gained another mile of territory, the slaves that were living in that territory would be free. And slaves also had a greater motivation to rebel or to escape to Union lines, because if they could do that, then they would be free. Um, and just to sum that up, all the territorial gains made by the North meant more freed slaves. Um, and as a practical matter, African Americans understood better than whites did that slavery's days were numbered, even in those slave states that remained in the Union, like Kentucky or Missouri, for example. Slavery, they knew, would come to an end, and of course we know it did. Um, Another important benefit of the proclamation was that it worked strongly against the British coming into the war on the side of the South. This would have been a disaster for the North. The British were still the strongest military power in the world, and they depended on Southern cotton, and the Union Navy was blockading Southern ports and preventing that cotton from getting through to Britain. But now, abolitionists in Britain had a powerful argument against coming into the war, because the North was clearly fighting the war uh, partially to end slavery, and or at least with the effect that as they gained territory, they would free slaves. And if the British had come into the war on the side of the South, they would have prevented that from happening. Abolition was a very strong movement in Britain. They had ended slavery in 1837, so well before, or actually 1833, and then it was completely over in 1838. So this has a significant effect. Um, the the British, uh, as I just explained, uh, were opposed to, some of them were opposed to the North because they interfered with the cotton trade, but others who were abolitionists were uh, defenders of the North. In New Year's Day, 1863, the proclamation was read to troops. This is a regiment of African American troops who heard the proclamation on that day.